They showed up at dawn, cutting through an iron gate like they owned the place, claiming to enforce HOA rules. But they didn't know the man behind that gate was the chief of police. The sun wasn't even up yet when Thomas Murphy heard it, a metallic scream that didn't belong in the calm of his suburban street. For a second, he thought it was a dream, but when he reached the window, he saw sparks. 2 men in reflective vests were cutting through his brand-new iron gate. That's when he stepped outside, and everything changed. The shriek sliced through the silence like a scalpel, pulling Thomas Murphy out of his sleep before the sun even crested the horizon. At first, it didn't register. The dissonant wail of metal grinding against metal felt too surreal for his sleepy brain to categorize. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe the city crew had started work early. But as the sound persisted, as the buzz deepened into a vicious, high-pitched scream, he knew it was neither. Thomas threw off the covers and slid out of bed, the cool floorboards meeting his feet. He wrapped his robe tight and walked with urgency toward the window that overlooked his front lawn. His fingers gripped the curtain, parting it just enough to peer through without revealing himself. What he saw froze him in place. 2 men. Both wore navy blue uniforms and reflective vests with large block letters reading HOA Enforcement. They were hunched over his wrought iron gate, an industrial power saw clenched between them. The tool screeched like a banshee as sparks flew in all directions, some dancing in the dewy grass like angry fireflies. Thomas blinked, once, twice, but the scene didn't change. His custom gate, installed just last year, was being carved up like scrap metal, without a warning, without permission, without sense. Was there an emergency? A fire? A gas leak? No. He would have been contacted. And this didn't look like urgency. It looked like control. It looked like arrogance. Adrenaline surged through his chest as he turned and bolted down the stairs. He didn't bother grabbing his phone. He didn't need it. Not yet. Whoever they were, they didn't know who he was. But they would. As Thomas flung open the front door and stepped into the cool pre-dawn air, he wasn't just a homeowner, he was the chief of police. The early morning breeze slapped Thomas in the face as he strode across his porch. The sharp sting of cold air did little to cool the heat building in his chest. "Hey!" he barked, his voice projecting across the neatly manicured lawn like a cannon blast. "What do you think you're doing?" The grinding stopped, abruptly. One of the men, tall and broad-shouldered, turned slowly, not startled but casual. He had a neatly trimmed beard, the kind that seemed manicured for intimidation. His orange vest glowed faintly in the dim light as he glanced down at a clipboard and then up again. "Sir, please stay back," he said, voice flat and robotic, like he was reading off a cue card. "You're in violation of HOA regulations." Thomas squinted. "HOA?" he repeated slowly. "Yes, sir," the man replied confidently. "This gate exceeds the maximum height allowed. We've received multiple complaints. We're here to remove it." Thomas took one step down onto the walkway, eyes narrowed. "You've made a mistake," he said. "This property isn't under any HOA. I made sure of that when I bought this house." The man's expression didn't change. The younger worker beside him, thinner, more jittery, shifted his weight from foot to foot, glancing nervously between the gate and Thomas. "I'll need to see your paperwork," Thomas said firmly. "A work order, an official complaint, something signed." Without missing a beat, the bearded man produced a crumpled sheet of paper and held it up. Thomas took a few steps closer. No letterhead, no signature, no official seal, just cheap text printed in bold violation notice, OAA enforcement, a fake. Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. This wasn't a city order. This wasn't a utility company. This was a scam. But a bold one. Calculated, brazen. And worst of all, they'd chosen his house, his gate. He took a breath, centering himself. These men had no idea who they were dealing with. That was about to change. The saw roared back to life before Thomas could say another word. Sparks exploded again in a flurry of orange, lighting the men's uniforms like a warped 4th of July display. The screeching tore through the morning like a siren, echoing down the quiet street and turning heads inside nearby houses. Thomas stepped fully off his porch now, his pace measured but full of purpose. "Turn it off," he commanded. "Now." The younger man hesitated, clearly shaken, but the bearded one didn't even flinch. He raised his hand like a traffic cop. "Sir, you're interfering with an active HOA operation," he said sharply. We understand you may be upset, but your emotional reaction doesn't change the violation. Thomas's brows furrowed. Emotional reaction? This wasn't some neighborly misunderstanding. This was an illegal demolition on private property. His voice tightened. Where's your ID? He asked. Badge. Business card. Something real. The bearded man pulled out a plastic card from his vest pocket and held it out with the barest hint of effort. Thomas took one look. No hologram, no barcode, no identification number. Just cheap plastic with the words HOA Enforcement Division typed in black Arial font. It might as well have said Make-Believe Department. Behind Thomas, a door creaked open. A neighbor across the street peeked out, phone already in hand, quietly filming. A second neighbor emerged with a bathrobe on, murmuring on a video call. They're doing it! Hoa's finally cracking down on the big guy's gate. Thomas's jaw tightened. Not only were these imposters bold, but they were convincing. His neighbors were buying the act. A deep anger flared in his chest, not just because his gate was being destroyed, but because these men were weaponizing fake authority in broad daylight and getting away with it. At least, they thought they were. He took one final step forward, his voice dropping an octave. This is your last warning. Step away from the gate. The bearded man's eyes narrowed, his fake confidence now strained. He took a step closer to Thomas, trying to loom large, chest puffed and posture rigid. Sir, I strongly advise you to return to your home, he warned, his voice dripping with condescension. You're escalating the situation. Non-compliance can lead to citation, or worse. Worse, Thomas echoed, the word falling from his mouth like a dare. Across the street, another neighbor emerged with their phone pointed directly at the scene. Someone whispered, "This guy's about to get arrested. For his own gate?" Another muttered, "What even is this Hoa?" The saw sputtered again, and the younger worker, his hand trembling now, lifted it toward the gate. "Keep cutting," the bearded man ordered curtly. Thomas had had enough. He exhaled slowly, not in surrender, but control. 20 years on the force had taught him never to rush when precision mattered. His next move wasn't a shout or a threat. It was a badge. With calm deliberation, Thomas reached into the pocket of his robe and pulled out his leather wallet. He flipped it open, revealing a gleaming gold shield under the early light of dawn. It caught the glow like a flare. Chief of Police, Oak Ridge Township. The effect was immediate. The younger worker recoiled like he'd been slapped, his grip on the saw loosening until the tool dropped to the ground with a thud. The bearded man stiffened, his arms twitching like a statue cracking under pressure. "Wait," he stammered. This isn't what?" Thomas asked, his voice suddenly colder. "Trespassing? Vandalism? Impersonating a government official?" The tension snapped like a pulled wire. From behind, phones were still rolling. A kid across the street mouthed the words, "Oh my God, he's the chief." The bearded man opened his mouth but found no words. Thomas took a measured step forward, voice low and final. "Shut the saw off. Put your hands where I can see them. This little act, it's over." And the neighborhood? Already live-streaming it all. The taller man's composure crumbled almost instantly. His hand went up in surrender, not the confident gesture of someone in charge, but the weak plea of a man caught in a lie. His shoulders sagged, and his eyes darted toward the younger worker, who was still frozen, hands limp by his sides. Thomas didn't need to raise his voice. His badge had done all the talking for him. "Now, I'm going to give you one more chance," Thomas said, his voice calm but firm, like he was handling a suspect who didn't realize how deep they were in trouble. "Shut down the saw and step away from my gate." There was a long pause, an uncomfortable silence stretching as thick as the tension in the air. The younger man's eyes flicked nervously from Thomas to the saw and back again, his body tense, as if trying to make a decision he couldn't quite settle on. "I said, shut it off," Thomas repeated, this time with a hint of finality. The bearded man's lips parted, but the words got stuck somewhere in his throat. The younger worker finally took a half step back, letting the saw fall to the ground with a clatter. By now, a few more neighbors had joined the growing crowd on the sidewalk, their phones raised high. Laughter and whispers began to filter through the early morning air, people finally realizing what was happening. They weren't just watching a typical HOA dispute, they were witnessing a public takedown of a couple of scammers who had pushed their luck too far. Thomas stood motionless, watching the men's humiliation unfold. He knew they weren't just going to apologize and walk away. But the cold satisfaction of having them finally realize who they were dealing with was enough to make his pulse steady again. "Drop the act," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "You've already crossed several lines. You've been trespassing, damaging my property, and impersonating officials. There's more than enough evidence to make your morning even worse. And I'm going to make sure every bit of it gets logged." The bearded man looked like he wanted to say something, a protest, a defense, a lie. But nothing came out. He had nothing left. From behind the crowd, one of the neighbors shouted, "Guess they didn't do their homework, huh?" Another one snickered. Guess the HOA enforcers didn't expect to mess with the chief. The bearded man's smugness was gone now, replaced with pure frustration. He turned to the younger worker, who was still standing by the saw, hands shaking. "This wasn't supposed to happen," the bearded man muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Tell me something I don't know," Thomas said, his gaze never leaving the two impostors. Just as the last spark from the saw fizzled into the grass, a distant sound echoed through the neighborhood, the familiar high-pitched wail of sirens. They weren't aggressive, not blaring, but purposeful, controlled, approaching. The taller man flinched at the sound, turning toward the street. The younger one took a full step back, eyes wide and lips trembling. "You called the cops?" the bearded one asked, his voice now thin, disbelief creeping in. Thomas raised an eyebrow, tilting his head slightly. "I am the cops." Right on cue, a patrol car rounded the corner and pulled up in front of Thomas's house. The red and blue lights lit up the neighborhood like a warning flare. Two officers stepped out quickly but calmly, hands resting on their belts, expressions alert. Officer Ramirez, one of Thomas's most trusted men, approached the scene with quiet authority. He glanced at the broken gate, the scorched metal, then at the two men now frozen like deer in headlights. Ramirez looked at Thomas and nodded. "Chief, want us to take it from here?" Thomas gave a short nod. "Yes. 2 suspects, caught impersonating HOA officials, destroying private property and trespassing, possibly more depending on what we dig up." Ramirez didn't hesitate. "Understood." He turned to the taller man and smoothly pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Sir, place your hands behind your back." Wait, we can explain," the bearded man stammered, panic finally setting in. "To what?" Thomas asked sharply. "Explain how you showed up before sunrise with power tools and forged documents? Or maybe you want to explain why you're impersonating government officials and intimidating homeowners?" The younger man didn't resist as the second officer cuffed him. His voice cracked as he whispered, "We didn't know. We were just following instructions." Ramirez paused, glancing back at Thomas. "Instructions from who?" Thomas asked, stepping forward. The younger man's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The bearded man shot him a glare, silently commanding him to stay quiet. That glare didn't go unnoticed. "Interesting," Thomas said. "So, you were working for someone?" Ramirez gently pushed the taller man toward the squad car. As the officers led the 2 suspects away, neighbors clapped quietly, murmured, and laughed. One woman shouted from her porch, "Real OA doesn't bring power saws at 6 a.m. Genius!" The crowd chuckled, cameras still rolling, uploading and live streaming every second. But Thomas didn't smile, because beneath the absurdity, he saw something darker. These guys weren't just sloppy scammers. They were part of something organized, and the real danger hadn't shown up yet. Back at the station, the chaos of the morning was already filtering through the precinct like wildfire. Officers nodded respectfully as Thomas walked through the halls, but many couldn't help but glance sideways, their curiosity barely concealed. Thomas wasn't in the mood for gossip. He moved past the bullpen and into the observation room overlooking Interrogation B. The 2 impostors sat in silence on opposite sides of the table, their navy uniforms now rumpled, fake badges removed, and the illusion of authority long gone. The bearded man stared at the wall, his jaw clenched. The younger one, pale and visibly shaken, tapped his foot uncontrollably beneath the table. He looked like he was about to break. Officer Ramirez stood beside Thomas, arms folded. "They're stonewalling," Ramirez said. "Won't give up a name, just keep saying it was a job. But Chief, this isn't a couple of freelancers with a stolen saw. We ran the plates on their truck, rented with a corporate card, shell company, registered 2 counties over." Thomas narrowed his eyes. "Name on the rental? None. It's listed to Pinarus Solutions," Ramirez replied. "No actual office, just a P.O. box in a business park that doesn't even have signage." Thomas's eyes locked on the 2 suspects through the glass. His instincts, honed from years of chasing down the criminally clever, were now tingling with certainty. This isn't random. This was planned. These guys were organized, confident, and too prepared for amateurs, he said. They've done this before, probably more than once. Ramirez nodded grimly. We checked. At least 4 neighborhoods reported similar incidents in the past 6 weeks. Fake Hoa crews showing up before dawn, citing nonsense violations and demanding payment, or dismantling property on the spot. Homeowners assumed they were real. Thomas's jaw tightened. Which means someone's building a network, he said, and whoever's pulling the strings knows how to stay invisible. He didn't wait any longer. He pushed open the door to the interrogation room. The click of the handle made both men flinch. Thomas walked in slowly and sat down across from them. He removed his badge and set it gently on the table between them, not to intimidate, but to remind them who held the real authority now. You've had time to think, he said evenly. So here's your one chance to make this easier. The younger man looked like he wanted to speak, but the bearded one shot him a glare. Thomas saw it, that moment of fear, not of jail, of someone else. Who are you working for? Thomas asked. His voice didn't rise, but it sliced like ice. The younger man's lips trembled. A guy named Crane, he whispered. The bearded man slammed his palm against the table. Shut up! Thomas didn't blink. His voice dropped lower. Too late. Crane. Now he had a name. And it was only the beginning. Thomas stepped out of the interrogation room without saying another word, leaving the suspects in a fog of tension. Ramirez was waiting just outside, leaning against the wall, arms folded. Crane, Thomas said quietly. Ramirez raised an eyebrow. That's who they gave up? Thomas nodded. First name? No. Address? No. All they gave was Mr. Crane, like he's some myth. Well, he just became real, Ramirez muttered, pulling out his notepad. I'll have Cyber look into aliases and corporate filings. Maybe it's a shell. Maybe it's a ghost. Thomas rubbed his temple. No. This guy's real. And careful. He's using layers, shell companies, fake contractors, disposable numbers. He's got pawns everywhere, and none of them know the full picture. Ramirez hesitated. They're scared, Chief, but not of jail. Thomas looked up sharply. Exactly. They're afraid of Crane. He turned and walked toward his office, mind buzzing. Back at his desk, he opened the incident report from that morning. He reviewed the HOA violation printout again. The same bold text, vague language, no seals or signatures. Just the name HOA Enforcement Division and a return address that didn't exist. It was theater, cheap paper, meant to sell authority. Ramirez entered the office a few minutes later, holding a slim folder. We got something, Chief, he said, handing it over. A payment trail. One of the actual HOAs in a nearby subdivision, Oak Hills, cut a check last month, $5,000 to Pinarest Solutions. Guess who filed the payment? Thomas opened the folder. A scanned copy of a financial statement showed the name Pinarest Solutions, Community Strategy Consultation. And there, at the bottom, the signature of the HOA board president, a woman named Deborah Klein. Thomas stared at the signature. She on the level? He asked. We're checking now, Ramirez replied. But here's the kicker. That same company shows up on financial records for 3 other HOA boards, all within 50 miles, all within the last 6 months. Thomas felt the web tightening. This wasn't just petty fraud anymore. This was a system. These fake enforcers weren't freelance, Thomas said. They're part of a syndicate, targeting middle to upper-class neighborhoods with weak oversight. And Crane? Ramirez asked. He's the spider in the center. Thomas stood and grabbed his coat. Pull Klein's contact info. I want to know if she's dirty or just another puppet. As Ramirez got to work, Thomas glanced back at the folder. Crane wasn't hiding anymore. He was moving pieces, and Thomas was now one of them, or so Crane thought. 2 nights later, Thomas sat in his unmarked car across from a bland beige building in a sleepy strip mall. The sign above the door read Pinarest Solutions, Community Consulting, but it was barely lit, and the windows were covered with cheap blinds. No business hours, no nameplate, just a legal front with nothing behind it. Inside, faint movement, a silhouette. Thomas adjusted his binoculars. A tall man in a black jacket locked the door from inside. His movements were efficient, calm, too precise to be someone just closing shop. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't nervous. He was trained. Thomas's phone buzzed. It was Ramirez. "Chief," he said immediately, "we traced the number one of the suspects gave us. It bounced through 2 burner phones before dying, but the pings, they all hit towers within 5 miles of your house." Thomas's brow furrowed. "Crane's been watching," he murmured. "Close, testing the fence line." "There's more," Ramirez added. "One burner pinged 5 streets over yesterday." Thomas's jaw clenched. "He's not just testing the system, he's testing me." He watched the man in the dark jacket walk calmly to a black SUV parked behind the building. No tags on the vehicle, no bumper stickers, windows tinted deeper than legal. The man got in, turned the engine over, and pulled into the street. Thomas waited a beat, then started his own car and followed, headlights off. The SUV weaved through side streets with surgical ease before turning onto a back road lined with trees. Sparse streetlights made the route feel like a tunnel. This wasn't just a way home. It was a trail. It felt like bait. After 10 more minutes, the SUV pulled up to a massive gate set into stone pillars. A camera rotated above. The gate swung open on its own. The SUV rolled inside, and the gate closed again. Thomas parked 100 yards back, hidden under the canopy of darkness. Then his phone buzzed again. No number, no caller ID, just a single text message. "You're a long way from home, Chief." Thomas stared at the screen. Not only was Crane watching, he knew, and now the game had changed. Thomas wasn't investigating a scam anymore. He'd walked into a war. The night air was still, almost too still, as Thomas sat in his unmarked cruiser, engine off, headlights dark, hands motionless on the steering wheel. He stared through the windshield at the mansion on the hill. Lights flickered behind expensive curtains, a fortress, not just of wealth, but secrets. He read the message again. "You're a long way from home, Chief." It wasn't a warning, it was a welcome. Crane knew he was here. He wanted him to be. Thomas's pulse stayed steady, but his mind raced. That text wasn't a mistake, it was control. A man like Crane didn't just run scams, he ran people, used fear like currency. And if he had the means to monitor police movement, burner phones, shell companies, and HOA boards, then this was no local scheme, it was a network. Crane wasn't building a con, he was building infrastructure, a fake enforcement empire in plain sight. Neighborhoods policed by ghosts. Fines paid in cash, threats delivered with a smile and a clipboard, and now he was signaling that the real game had begun. Thomas exhaled through his nose and started the engine. He didn't follow, not tonight. Instead, he returned to the station, where Ramirez was waiting with a red folder marked Financial Disclosure. Internal Hewa audit request. "We pulled more records," Ramirez said. "Pinarus Solutions has appeared in 8 HOA budgets now. All of them approved quietly, no contractor bids. Some of the board presidents don't even remember authorizing them." Thomas opened the folder. On the last page, a name caught his eye. Deborah Klein. Again, "She shows up on 2 different HOA boards," Ramirez said. "She's not just a signature, she's a hub." Thomas nodded slowly. "Start surveillance on her. Quietly. If Crane's testing proximity, he's got eyes on these people, and we need to see what they don't know they're part of." Ramirez hesitated. "And if she's not a pawn?" Thomas's eyes were steel. "Then we'll treat her like a queen protecting the king." The board was set. The pawns had been sacrificed. And now it was a war between a shadow empire and a man who had no intention of blinking first. Chief Thomas Murphy wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever.